Scrolling through the comments of our last episode, Wall of Water, I came across one that haunted me. Ironically, the lack of evidence for this claim is what makes it food for thought. It posited the existence of a great filter, a kind of conscious cauldron that keeps civilizations quiet, equalized by way of a firm ceiling, a lawnmower for our cosmic yard, so to speak. The comment read, "The harshest parts of the universe we are not supposed to know about. One such is called the Screaming Nexus, a representation of an ancient sentient entity that feeds on the memories and emotions of civilizations across time and space. Like some kind of Lovecraftian cosmic horror, its tendrils extend out, pulling remnants of entire worlds into its stomach. This allegorical nexus balances the universe by erasing civilizations that grow too powerful, ensuring celestial equilibrium. It is both an observer and a destroyer. Like any allegory, this personified monstrosity is meant to illustrate a concept outside of our language-based thinking. People may, however, take it as literal and run with it as an objective truth. And we'll come back to that possibility at the end. What got me pondering, though, is that this modern depiction is not unique in its purpose. Throughout mythology, we see variations of this theme, the most famous being the Tower of Babel. Mortal men decided to raise themselves up to be parallel with the divine. The divine interfered by scattering the languages of the workers, causing chaos, ending the project swiftly and thoroughly. In each of these variations, something is often overlooked by the reader, despite being made clear within the codex itself. It is a society of people, humans in the plural, that are given this brutal cosmic haircut when they get too big for their britches. In the same mythologies, however, individuals are not inhibited by the divine to experience and even become unified with it, i.e., the kingdom of heaven is within, a timeless axiom that shakes hands with Eastern teachings of Zen. So you, me, and even Sean can, like Enoch becoming Metatron, attain divine liberation through gnosis and righteous living. But when an entire society attempts to make this jump all at once, something somewhere, yet also nowhere, swoops in to not only trim the leaves, but to rip it up from the roots for a fresh, admittedly fierce start from nothing. To not be reminded of our cataclysmic cosmic resets would be foolish. We have shown many times on this channel how allegory is used to teach a particularly abstract idea or lesson in a familiar way. The reason they feel familiar is simple. They are based in a seed of objective truth, the memory of which is stored in our DNA and recognized as archetypes. Backtracing the pathological past of parabolic lore, ancient wisdom, etc., seems to always lead to a spore of literal happening. The way to do this is combining modern findings with the stories of their birth, stories that have been thrown out with the bathwater. There are few better examples than the story of Atlantis. Until recently, the only source of its existence was Plato. But Plato's account has become a tennis ball in an echo chamber of people recalling what they heard, leaving us digesting a copy of a copy. Today, I'd like to read the codex straight off the paper pages. Doing so might spark connections that we simply can't see when only swallowing gist. Now, there is certainly plenty to learn from the work of great philosophers, allegory or not. But if there is any hard evidence that leads us to a literal happening that catalyzed the myth, it will come from geology, geography, and archeology. And if any modern day findings are impossibly predicted by the writers of classical philosophy, those guns will be found smoking in one place, a surprisingly clear and detailed codex by one of the greatest outside-the-box thinkers of all time. A plethora of connections beyond coincidence is found in Timaeus and Critias, the widely reviewed, often mistranslated manuscripts of one of the only men who had the plug on pinpointing an original source. Today, we will painstakingly break down the foundational framework of Plato's account.
In our last episode, we looked at impossible stonework built by a people that no one can seem to identify. Impossible not just because of size alone, but also utility and engineering, hinting at ancient technology that differs from ours in that it worked harmoniously with the laws of nature instead of exploitation. We see only the fruits of their work, but are left with no clues as to how. The ancients who adopted the current sites admit that they found or inherited them, and were not around to see them built by people or beings considered godlike. We also covered the recent uncovering of ancient sites like Troy and Babylon, that until now were only legend. What we didn't address was that the OG megalithic stone sites, such as pyramids, are laid out in a repeatable pattern across the earth, as if all the builders were in cahoots, knowing that whatever the earth itself didn't swallow and or grind into dust by way of gigantic moving ice sheets, quakes, and tsunamis, might have been intentionally moved from the ruins of Atlantis to various locations on Earth that harmonize with its magnetic centers, roughly called ley lines, that seem to act as the chakras of Earth, assuming that it, like us, as above so below, is a living being. But a lot of those open-ended questions and mystery can actually be answered, surprisingly, by a man who didn't have this new data. Because what ties all of these puzzle pieces was passed down from Egypt to the Stoics of Greece. The answers to all the above riddles seem to come together in one graceful swoop when we read Plato's account. What we are about to see is clear and beyond coincidence. The obvious route the critics take is that Plato invented Atlantis as an allegory to illustrate a perfect society, because political discourse was indeed one of his main jams. But that assumption ignores a few things. One, Plato describes Atlantis as being strange, otherworldly, and frankly a brutal place where certain elites had permission to commit murder, something that a Stoic would deem very not cool. And way more importantly, he says twice within his account specifically that it is not allegory. He also gives specific measurements that in no way would apply to an allegory, measurements that match modern geographical finds unknown to Plato. The only debunk we have left is that Plato's time on Earth was nowhere near the supposed time of Atlantis. So this is not just second or third hand accounts, but passed down a long line of Greeks before reaching Plato as a young boy. Here's an illustration that should not be confused with fun-loving Greek diving boards. Long story short, a much older relative of Plato named Solon once traveled to Egypt in search of the finest wisdom that can be attained. This is not unusual, as we know that Egyptian priest kings were considered in the highest regard of maintaining esoteric wisdom. After all, they had created heaven on earth. What was rare was an outsider being worthy enough to actually get in to speak with these, frankly, godlike people. Solon made the cut, despite being considered a child, just like all Greeks, and frankly, anyone outside of Egypt. The priests told Solon that many worlds have come and gone over eons of time, and that the Greeks' account of the Great Flood, despite being accurate, was only the newest. The oldest of priest kings gave Solon a time frame of an enormously powerful city called Atlantis. Plato puts this date at 9,000 years before his time, and his time was 630 BC, about 2,600 years ago. That puts the date of Solon's Atlantis, as written by Plato, at 11,600 years ago, give or take a few hundred. If you haven't guessed it already, this pinpoints the modern mainstream geology we have concerning the younger Dryas cataclysm. If Plato made it up, he absolutely nailed the date. And I don't think the Greeks were out here carbon dating ice core samples. This goes to show us how well sacred oral tradition was kept in the absence of the internet. Like the ancient shamans we have spoken of, men of truth like this hold knowledge as very rare and dear to them. So when they passed it down, they did so very carefully and meticulously, and only to the most unreadable minds of the most uncrackable men. This oral preservation of knowledge might seem barbaric to a person who can just ask Google anything on the fly. But if you think about it, that means we depend on an instant, therefore electronic form of information. If and when this instant information is changed without our consent, well, we no longer have a concrete backup that would keep those changes in check. We'll be running around declaring false information as fact with full confidence. Why does this sound familiar? Being quite the opposite of instant, Plato's account is packed with specific descriptions and posits multiple sound scientific observations concerning erosion patterns, hydrology, and ways of agriculture that would be wildly out of place within a moral fiction. We should also pay some attention to how the old Egyptian priest kings are described as so much further advanced than the highest of Greek philosophers, pompous enough to openly yet kindly insult Solon as being an infant in knowledge. The Greeks were a proud people, and for that to even be left in the record means that personal egos must have been set aside to illustrate something for the greater good. Quick side note on that, big ups to Solon, bro. You know how stoic you gotta be to be called a child and ignorant for 3 straight minutes and then respond with, yes, noted, please continue on, sir. Hey, I tip my hat to that. I went through and cut everything I could that wasn't directly concerning or describing Atlantis from Plato's account and had this printed out. While reading this, let's all keep in mind the various locations said to have been home to Atlantis so that we can compare and contrast afterward. The current locations that have been hypothesized as Atlantis headquarters are numerous, but the usual suspects are the Caribbean, Brazil, Greenland, Antarctica, Malta, Ireland, and the Sahara Desert. All of these, of course, are before Eric von Dam Daniken solved this mystery when he moved Atlantis to outer space. Thanks for clearing that up, Dan. 2 of these in particular, I personally have a strong feeling for, but I want to leave that open for now as to not sway the viewer before reading Plato's account. We can match details after getting the raw information as to stay unbiased. The most important thing to keep in mind while reading this is that there was a grammatical error in the earliest translations from Plato's Greek, spilling over into all our books on it today. Plato never said Atlantic Ocean, but instead Atlantic Pelagos, which is more like a bay. As we will see, this changes everything location-wise because it was said that you had to cross this body of water to get to the location of the ruins. And he also never wrote that it sank, another translation error. He said that it was covered by water. This little nugget changes everything about the geology of the subject. Keeping those things in mind, let's start with Plato's Timaeus, written in 360 BCE. In the delta of Egypt, where the Nile parts in 2, there is a certain district called Sadic. Solon said that when he traveled there, he was held in great esteem. When he was questioning their priests, he discovered that neither he himself nor any other Greek knew anything at all. Damn. He attempted to tell them the most ancient of our traditions concerning the first man and the legend about the flood. One of their priests, a prodigiously old man, said, "O Solon, you Greeks are always children. There is not such a thing as an old Greek. You are young in soul, every one of you. You possess not a single belief that is ancient and derived from old tradition, nor one science that is hoary with age. There have been, and there will be, many and diverse destructions of mankind, of which the greatest are by fire and water. The story that is told in your country of how the son of Helios yoked his father's chariot and was unable to drive it along the course taken by his father and burnt up all that was upon the earth and perished by a thunderbolt, that story, as it is told, has the fashion of a legend. But the truth of it lies in the occurrence of a shifting of the bodies in the heavens, a destruction of things on the earth by fierce fire, which recurs at long intervals. So, right off the bat, we see that Egyptian priests understood the literal science behind allegory and were not superstitious with religious fervor as we have been told. In this case, pointing out that an ancient Greek myth stems from an even more ancient knowledge of astronomy and geology, specifically the friction between the two. At such times, they that dwell on the mountains suffer destruction more than those who dwell near the sea. And in our case, the Nile, our savior in other ways, saves us also at times from this calamity by rising high. And when the gods purge the earth with a flood of waters, all the herdsmen and shepherds in the mountains are saved, but those in the cities of your land are swept into the sea. In our country, neither then nor at any other time does the water pour down from above. On the contrary, it all tends naturally to well up from below. It is for these reasons that what is here preserved is reckoned to be the most ancient. All such events are recorded and preserved here in our temples. Your people and the others are but newly equipped every time. When, after the usual interval of years, the flood from heaven comes sweeping down, it leaves none of you, but the unlettered and uncultured, so that you become young as ever, with no knowledge of all that happened in old times, in this land or in your own. The genealogies you related just now, Solon, are little better than children's fairy tales. You remember but one deluge, though many had occurred previously. You are ignorant of the fact that the noblest and most perfect race among men were born in the land where you now dwell. This has escaped your notice because for many generations, the survivors died with no power to express themselves in writing. At one time, Solon, before the greatest destruction by water, what is now the Athenian state was supremely well organized in all respects. It is said that it possessed the most splendid works of art and the noblest polity of any nation under heaven. Hearing this, Solon marveled with the utmost eagerness and requested the priest recount for him exactly all the facts about those citizens of old. The priest then said, "The goddess has nurtured and trained them. Yours first by the space of 1,000 years and ours after. The duration of our civilization, as set down in our sacred writings, is 8,000 years. Of the citizens then who lived 9,000 years ago, I will declare to you their noblest deeds." And again, that math checks out with impossible coincidence, or of course, no coincidence at all. With regard to wisdom, the law here has devoted from the very beginning to the cosmic order. And within the text itself, the words cosmic and order are both capitalized, indicating something specific. Not a cosmic order, but the cosmic order, referring to a divine blueprint that guides all things. To the cosmic order by discovering all the effects which the divine causes produced upon human life, down to divination and the art of medicine, which aims at health. Wow, so their medicine aimed at health instead of profit. Wild. The goddess has furnished you before all others. With all this orderly and regular system, she established your state, since she perceived therein a climate duly blended and how it would bring forth men of supreme wisdom. Great are the achievements of your state, but there is one which stands out above all for both magnitude and nobleness. It is related in our records how once your state stayed the course of a mighty host, which starting from a distant point in the Atlantic Ocean. So, all right, here's where we got to stop and remember the most important point of this reading, that Plato never said ocean, but instead Pelagos, which is, again, more like a bay. This seems to put the lost ruins somewhere across the Red Sea, so south of these guys rather than west and across the entire Atlantic Ocean. Some of you might already know where this is going. Starting from a distant point in the Atlantic, Pelagos was insolently advancing to attack the whole of Europe and Asia to boot. So Canada, Atlantis was in Canada, problem solved. The ocean, Pelagos, there was at that time navigable. For in front of the mouth, which you Greeks call the Pillars of Heracles, lay an island which was larger than Libya and Asia together. Lying within the mouth is evidently a haven having a narrow entrance, but that yonder is a real ocean, and the land surrounding it may most rightly be called, in the fullest and truest sense, a continent. Okay, so interesting that there is an emphasis on it being part of a full-blown continent, while also several times referring to the city as an island. And he just said yonder, so it was obviously in Kentucky. And that must be why the forensic artist recreation of the Priest King came back looking like this. Atlantis is described as an island that is part of a full-blown continent. In this island of Atlantis, there existed a confederation of kings of marvelous power, which held sway over all the islands. This host, being all gathered together, made an attempt to enslave by one single onslaught, both your country and ours. It was then, Solon, that the manhood of your state showed itself conspicuous for valor and might in the sight of all the world, partly standing alone by itself when deserted by all others. After encountering the deadliest perils, it defeated the invaders and reared a trophy saved from slavery. F***ing rad. There's no way to ignore how badass that is. But what's interesting is, despite calling him a child, Solon was also praised about his ancestors. We call this a compliment sandwich. And man, this priest king would make a great office manager. Strict but fair. At a later time, there occurred portentous earthquakes and floods. One grievous day and night befell them. 1. When the whole body of your warriors was swallowed up by the earth, and the island of Atlantis was swallowed up by the sea and vanished. Now, vanish seems to have held up, but as cool and dramatic as it might be, new translations show us that swallowed was also assumed in translation, probably by a scholar whose wife wouldn't. But the word used here was actually covered. Keep that in mind, it'll be handy later. The ocean in that spot has now become impassable and unsearchable, being blocked up by the shoal mud which the island created as it settled. The mud blockage described here was also written about by two other dependable classicists, including Aristotle, as being in that same location. This gives us a hint later. All right, so that's what I got on Timaeus. And now moving into the only other manuscript by Plato on the subject, called Critias. Critias kicks off repeating what might be one of the more important aspects here. We must recall the fact that 9,000 is the sum of years since the war occurred between the dwellers beyond the Pillars of Heracles and all that dwelt within them. As regards the numerous barbaric tribes that then existed, the sequel of our story, as it were, unrolled. Okay, so a little racist there, but we'll keep it reeled in. This clearly seems to refer to the native cultures all over the earth who independently report being visited by last episode's Promethean figures after the Great Flood to teach them their ways, the ways that we use today. What's also interesting here is that there's a war described at the same time that we have the deluge. And I'm wondering if that is, whether it's a translation error or if some kind of war of technological proportions in Atlantis seem to coincide with a natural disaster that might not be as natural as we're assuming. The gods were taking over by lots the whole earth according to its regions, not according to the results of strife. A little disheartening, but this doesn't seem to have been an attempt to relieve suffering, but an obligation. Teaching the natives was a job to be done. Sometimes I wonder where we would be today if otherwise. They received each one his own. They settled their countries, and when they had settled them, they reared us up as herdsmen rear their flocks, to be their cattle and nurslings. Only it was not our bodies that they constrained by bodily force, like shepherds guiding their flocks, but they directed from the stern, where the living creature is easiest to turn about, laying hold on the soul, or psyche in today's talk, by persuasion, according to their own disposition, and thus they drove and steered all mortal kind. This is fascinating. First of all, I guess we are being farmed, so I owe someone $1. But this refers to gods driving humans. Does this refer to them coming into people, like possession? Are they on Earth working with people manually? Or was it a group of extremely advanced people who were considered gods because of their technology? We can only speculate that. This land of ours, as being naturally congenial and adapted for virtue and wisdom, they planted as native to the soil men of virtue, and naturally congenial. This, frankly, reminds me of ley lines. When people are planted in these sacred places, they evolve more efficiently? I don't know. Nico brought up interest in this phrasing, planted men and native to the soil, as if they brought their own seeds. Metaphorical seeds, I'm suspecting. Perhaps this is the very foundation of our mysterious handbags found everywhere, forever, all the time. Of these citizens, the names are preserved, but their works have vanished, owing to the repeated destruction of their successors and the length of the intervening periods. The stock that survived on each occasion was a remnant of unlettered mountaineers, which had heard the names of the rulers, but little of their works. So they gladly passed on these names, but they had no knowledge. They were in want of the necessities of life. Their attention was given to their own needs, and all their talk was about that. And in consequence, they paid no regard to the happenings of bygone ages. Okay, so this might be the most important part of this for our lesson learning. This beautifully illustrates how limited we are in wisdom and learning while in survival mode. We don't create while struggling to just live, despite our purpose here being as co-creators. And if we might conspiracize just a little bit, if we can't create in this world, the world is then strictly created by the few people who realize this, money or not. Perhaps this is why the majority of people are kept at a very low income. It keeps the people in survival mode to not interfere with those who want to control the world or create reality, so to speak. By the same means of a greater macrocosm, perhaps this is why we weren't meant to eat from the fruit. Now, I mean, all other lands were surpassed by ours in goodness of soil. It was able to support a large host which was exempt from the laborers of husbandry. A strong proof is this: what is now left of our soil rivals any other in being all productive and abundant in crops. Might be a stretch, but this reminds me of the black soil that was used by ancient Amazonian peoples to grow crops. where it is very difficult to do so. And this special black soil was taught to the native Amazon by one of these Promethean figures, the daughter of the sun, covered last week. To add to this connection, the OG Egyptians were referred to as the Blackfoot people by adjacent cultures like Sumerians and such. And the foot is exactly what walks on the soils. This is absolutely no more unlikely than calling someone a green thumb. Their thumb ain't actually green. It's a way to identify a person based on association, based on their skills. The whole of the land lies like a promontory, jutting out from the rest of the continent, far into the sea, and all the cup of the sea around it is of great depth. Since many great convulsions took place during the 9,000 years, for such was the number of years from that time to this, the soil kept breaking away from the highlands during these ages and disasters, sliding away and disappearing in the deep. Just as happens in small islands, what now remains is like the skeleton of a sick man, the soft earth having wasted away and only the bare framework of the land being left. But the country was unimpaired, for its mountains had high arable hills. The moorlands, as they are now called, contained plains, full of rich soil. It had forest land in its mountains, of which there are visible signs even to this day, whereof the shrines, which still remain even now at the spots where the fountains formerly existed, are signs which testify that our present description of the land is true. Should go without saying, the theory that this account is an allegory by Plato is out the window by now. It says within, right there, that it is not. These shrines, though, there is a particular location that we will talk about that coordinates with this notion, a place that shows the footprint of many buildings that are now missing, possibly from looting or, as myth would have it, moved and relocated to new areas after the flood made this city unlivable and covered by the sea. For example, in British mythology, Stonehenge was moved from Ireland to where it is now. Moorlands, as referred to today, are famously fertile soils of Scotland and Ireland that produce ample legends of fairies and extra-dimensional beings. Now, this doesn't necessarily pinpoint the central headquarters of Atlantis, but it does ring a bell of last week's episode about the red-haired people that were the Promethean figures. That gene of having red hair and pale skin stems from Ireland. So that kind of gives us a hint as to the moving about of the ruins of Atlantis after it was destroyed. The action of a single night of extraordinary rain has crumbled it away and made it bare of soil, when earthquakes occurred simultaneously with the third of the disastrous floods. Another smoking gun right here, if you ask me. We have multiple ancient descriptions of a single night of, or one single day of, and then rain, earthquakes, etc. Meanwhile, that quickness is geologically exactly what we see as happening during the Younger Dryas cataclysm, an event that, as we saw above, also matching the exact dates expressed within this same account. At this point, ignorance is blindness, and we haven't even looked at the locations that match these measurable descriptions yet. They aimed at the mean between luxurious display and meanness, and built for themselves tasteful houses, where they and their children's children grew old and handed them on in succession unaltered. Poseidon took his allotment, the island of Atlantis, and settled therein the children whom he had begotten of a mortal woman. So Poseidon, making babies, does it with a mortal woman. This is interesting considering how often we see this archetype in mythology and religious text, most famously the Nephilim. It makes you wonder if the offspring were big. Is that silly? I mean, if we look at the architecture that was attributed to the scattered remnants of Atlantis, It's almost hard not to hypothesize this. These fallen angels were also said to share their ways of magic with mortals. And what is magic if not technology misunderstood? Bordering on the sea and extending through the center of the whole island, there was a plain. Near the plain, over against its center, at a distance of about 50 stades, there stood a mountain that was low on all sides. A pyramid? Poseidon made circular belts of sea and land enclosing one another, some greater, some smaller, 2 being of land and 3 being of sea. These belts were at even distances on all sides so as to be impassable for man. Poseidon himself set the central island, bringing up from beneath 2 springs of water, one flowing warm, the other cold. The first king then reigned and had the name of Atlas. A large family sprang from Atlas, but it was the eldest who, as king, always passed on the scepter to the eldest of his sons. Thus, they preserved the sovereignty for many generations, and the wealth they possessed was so immense that the like had never been seen. The island itself furnished most of the requirements of daily life. Metals to begin with, both the hard kind and the fusible kind, which are extracted by mining. Mining, 12,000 years ago. It contained a very large stock of elephants, for there was an ample food supply. Elephants. Let's jot that down. They bridged over the circles of sea which surrounded the ancient metropolis, making a road toward and from the royal palace. They had built in the palace at the very beginning, where the settlement was first made by their god and their ancestors, an abode amazing to behold for the magnitude and beauty of the workmanship. Beginning at the sea, they bored a channel right through the outermost circle, which was 3 plethora in breadth, 100 feet in depth, and 50 stades in length. Why so many units of measurement? Thus, the entrance to it from the sea was like that to a harbor for the greatest ships to sail through. Through the circles of land, which divided those of sea, bridges opened out a channel leading from circle to circle, and this they roofed over above so that the seaway was subterranean. For the lips of the land circles were raised sufficient height above the level of the sea. Yeah, we'll see. Wherein stood the royal palace 5 stades in diameter. Upon the bridges on each side, against the passages for the sea, they erected towers and gates. The stone they quarried from beneath the outer and inner circles, being white, some black, and some red. They constructed 2 inner docks, hollowed out and roofed over by the native rock. They covered with brass, as though with plaster, all the circumference of the wall which surrounded the outermost circle, and that of the inner one they coated with tin. That which encompassed the Acropolis itself with orichalcum, which sparkled like fire. I'm not sure what orichalcum is, or if anybody does. I wonder if there's a type of mineral that can be identified as that. But what's interesting is they coated the inner one with tin. The alchemical symbol for Jupiter is tin, isn't it? I wonder if that has any kind of pre-Zeus connection to it. In the center, there stood a temple sacred to Poseidon, reserved as holy ground, and encircled with a wall of gold. This being the spot where at the beginning they had generated to birth the royal lines. Thither, just when I think I got a good flow going, they hit me with thither. What does thither mean? Thither also the temple of Poseidon himself, which appeared symmetrical. And there was something of the barbaric in its appearance. All the exterior of the temple they coated with silver, save only the pinnacles which they coated in gold. As to the interior, they made the roof of all ivory. Well, if you got all them elephants, you're gonna be stocked up on ivory, I suppose. And PETA just entered the conversation. They placed therein golden statues of the god standing on a chariot and driving 6 winged steeds. Not that it matters, but I wonder if that means steeds with 6 wings, or the winged steeds were the quantity of 6. I don't know. Maybe I missed a comma or something. And around about him, 100 nereids on dolphins. Hey Siri. Define Nereids. A Bristol worm of the Polychati family. So more, just the definition of that is more words that I would need definitions for. Thanks, Siri. But man, humans have always been tight with dolphins, it seems, ever since the very beginning. But dolphins, Poseidon, water this, water that. A lot of water archetypes with Atlantis, even before it was destroyed by it. It's definitely a theme, and certainly a stretch here. But what if some of the survivors took their homes and technology to one of the few places that were safe from both surface disasters and nosy people? The bottom of the ocean. I mean, the majority of these credible UFO reports are actually USOs. They come up from the oceans. Most of them, the Atlantic Ocean. But hey, it's only speculation. Those who were the most trustworthy had dwellings granted to them within the Acropolis around about the kings. And right there is a perfect description of Agartha, like we talked about right here. Another safe place to take your home after a cataclysm would be underground. But again, speculation. Now we must account of the rest of the country. The whole region rose sheer out of the sea to a great height, but the parts about the city was all a smooth plain, encircled by mountains, which stretched as far as the sea. This region all along the island faced towards the south and was sheltered from the northern blasts. Northern blasts sounds like a badass Norwegian black metal song. Someone get Abath and Immortal on that if he can maybe put the dark beers down for 15 minutes. But an important geological feature described there is that it had mountains on all sides, shielding from north winds. The mountains which surrounded it were at that time celebrated as surpassing all that now exist in number, magnitude, and beauty, for they had upon them many rich villages of country folk. Each of the kings ruled over the men in his own particular portion and throughout his own city, punishing and putting to death whomsoever he willed. See, right there, Plato ain't having none of that. Thus, it is certainly not an example that he would parade about as a prime archetype of a perfect society. Their mutual relations were governed by the precepts of Poseidon as handed down to them by the law and by the records inscribed by the first princes on a pillar of orichalcum placed within the temple of Poseidon in the center of the island. Thither they assembled every 5th year and inquired if any had in any way transgressed and gave judgment. After praying that they might capture a victim well-pleasing unto him, hunted bulls with staves and nooses, but with no weapon of iron. Whatsoever bull they captured, they led up to the pillar and cut its throat over the top of the pillar, raining down blood on the inscription. Damn. Getting a bit dark now, and perhaps a bit of foreshadowing. Obviously, this is a time before our buddy JC turned up to put an end to all that kind of business. So, high five, Jesus. I do like the whole hunting bulls without weapons of iron thing, though. That sounds very difficult. Henceforth, they would not transgress any of the writings willingly. He drank of the cup and offered it up as a gift in the temple of the god. When darkness came, the princes robed themselves in beautiful sable vestments, sat on the ground beside the cinders of their sacramental victims throughout the night, and there they gave and received judgment. There were other laws concerning the peculiar rights of the several princes, that they should never take up arms against one another, and that should anyone attempt to overthrow any city, that they should all lend aid, taking counsel in common, conceding leadership to the royal branch of Atlas. Solid. So long as the inherited nature of the god remained strong in them, they were submissive to the law and kindly disposed to their divine kindred, for the intent of their hearts were noble, and they showed gentleness, joined with wisdom in dealing with the changes and chances in life. All of which right there, solid and inspiring. But I'd like to perk up your ears, especially for this next spot in the codex. Thus, their wealth did not make them drunk with pride, so that they lost control of themselves and went to ruin. Rather, in their soberness of mind, they clearly saw that all these good things are increased by general amity, combined with virtue, whereas the eager pursuit and worship of these goods not only causes the goods themselves to diminish, but makes virtue also perish with them. Wow. We can learn just about everything that we need from those two lines alone. Words that we certainly need now more than ever. As a result of such reasoning and the continuance of their divine nature, all their wealth had grown to such a greatness as previously described. But, here we go. When the portion of divinity within them was now becoming faint and weak through being oftentimes blended with a large measure of mortality, whereas the human temper was becoming dominant. Then at length, they lost their comeliness through being unable to bear the burden of their possessions, and became ugly to look upon in the eyes of him who has the gift of sight, those with eyes to see. But in the eyes of those who have no gift of perceiving what is the truly happy life, they appeared to be fair and blessed, filled with lawless ambition and power. Zeus, who reigns by law, has the gift of perceiving such things, marked how this righteous race was in evil plight, and desired to inflict punishment, to the end that when chastised, they might strike a truer note. I love that line, to the end that when chastised, they'll strike a truer note, indicating, the pride comes before the fall. And so before annihilation, these motherfuckers fit in to look in the mirror. And finally, the ominous last line. He assembled together all the gods into that abode, which they honor most, standing as it does at the center of all the universe, and beholding all things that partake of generation. And when he had assembled them, he spake thus. And of course, we have this famous ending here, cutting off mid-sentence, that sends chills down anyone's spine, especially after considering what was described in our intro today of this civilization-eating nexus. But philosophy like that can wait till the end of the video. Right now, let's take the details in this account and look at some locations. I think the first thing to do here is a process of elimination. The fact that the word ocean was actually Pelagos is going to clear out anything on the Western continents. Sorry to the fans of Bimini Road and the Caribbean. The nearest Pelagos we have would be more south instead of west. This entire area and roundabouts has many dynamic landforms that can resemble a so-called Pelagos. For this reason and a few others, we can quite plausibly move the so-called Pillars of Heracles from here to here. This is going to place our ruins of Atlantis in Africa, which frankly is not a surprise for many reasons. Obviously the elephants, but more subtle and untold, and probably more important, a lot of things that remain mysterious to us today can be stemmed back to Africa. Prime example is Egypt, the land of Chem. It's there. There seems to be, maybe a campaign to keep mainstream education from attributing great and glorious empires in general away from Africa. Weird, but not so weird if you consider who it was that once established and consolidated the now agreed upon world history. But this possible campaign of seemingly systematic cover-ups is crumbling under its own weight, though. So let's not conspire here, and let's reel it in and let's look at this thing. Now, like me, you are probably a huge fan of Jimmy. He has done a great job of detailing the Eye of the Sahara. I would like to nail down the main units of evidence that to me solidify this location. But for an in-depth look at this particular location, Jimmy and Johanna are pretty much unmatched. First of all, and possibly most obvious, is the shape and size. Plato described a central island surrounded by circular belts around it. The belts were, as quoted, 2 of land and 3 of sea. This is clearly the case here, to any toddler with a hand to count on. To reiterate, this alone creates a synchronicity beyond coincidence, to me at least. When you pile onto this the fact that specific measurements given in Plato's account also describe this anomalous land structure, well, a lawyer in a court of law might just put his feet up now and rest his case. But alas, we got more and more dots to connect. The entrance to Atlantis in Plato's account was a channel bored through the outermost circle that formed a harbor to the sea, the measurements of which are given in detail as well. We can see this right here. An old debunk of this was that there were no seafaring people that long ago. Modern archaeology has squashed that many times over, vindicating Plato not only with Atlantis, but also with his notion that there were advanced peoples long before we can recordably conceive. Boats back then were made of organic materials that obviously decompose when neglected for thousands of years, if not buried, which they were. In one case, a boat was preserved because of happen-chance airtight conditions under clay. What makes this wild is that it was found accidentally by someone just digging a well. Think about what that means for a moment. In archaeology, they target specific locations to dig, knowing that they cannot possibly dig up everything everywhere. So things like this get found by chance, meaning that there are probably ancient artifacts scattered around abundantly everywhere. And the older the artifact, the deeper it's buried. If there was an advanced civilization, say 100,000 years ago, versus this measly 12,000 years with the Great Flood, they could have had damn skyscrapers and vimanas, and we would never know about it outside of myth. This notion is haunting. And it makes the downright sci-fi flavored Hindu and Vedic mythologies of ancient reptile gods flying around on floating cities a lot more interesting and, dare I say, possible. Because let's keep in mind, myth and allegory always seems to stem from a seed of literal happening, just like we are clearly seeing here. Also within this account, Plato said the lips of the land circles were raised sufficient height above the sea level, wherein stood the royal palace that was 5 stades in diameter. And, well, Plato said that the city portions were all a smooth plain encircled by mountains that blocked the wind from the north. Plato described the various colors of stone quarried and used to build the cities and temples: white, black, and red. And, there you go. It was also said that the water rushed in and covered Atlantis after a single day of earthquakes. Geology has shown that this very location is a hotbed of volcanic activity. If the ground ruptured on the Atlantic side of the bullseye, activity that geologically checks out as affirmative, the water would have dumped into the entire city like a tsunami. And unfortunately, these outer mountains, so majestically described, would have contained it with no outlet, covered in violent waters, and vanished, just like Plato was told. This show is not about lists, and certainly not about proving anything to anyone. I like to focus on what all these things mean to us today. So I'll digress on these details and leave it to you if curious to find out more. But the connections here are important to illustrate the larger point. We as people are capable of utter blindness in the face of self-evident truths, just as much as we are capable of extraordinary feats. Which one of those we choose seems to be based on what we want to see and hear. So how do we go about getting these so-called eyes to see that are mentioned in the text and mythology worldwide? Plato's Atlantis account is not what he is famous for. His most renowned concept is very simply called Plato's cave allegory. We think the shadows on the wall are all that there is because that's all we've ever known. So when we finally do see the real world, it is so bright and jarring, it hurts to experience. And the weak yearn to return back to the cave that they once knew, before even giving themselves a chance to adjust their eyes to this new freedom of theirs. As we saw today, Plato's Critias cuts off mid-sentence. There are many explanations for why this is. Some say it was deemed too revealing for the Greeks' comfort. Some say it was stolen. Some say he just never got around to finishing the damn thing. Each explanation, to me, seems to forget who Plato was and is. I think Plato left it unfinished on purpose. A full stop just before what seems to be the most important line is an abrupt screeching halt to one person in particular, the reader. You. He pulls out right before you're about to come to terms with its deeper meaning, because the deeper meaning isn't up to him. We can't keep running to him or anyone else held in high regard every time we have doubts or thirst for answers. Plato and the other philosophers had a thirst for knowledge and wisdom, not closure. So let's pretend for a moment that the skeptics are right, and this entire thing is an allegory with specific nuggets and detail that they got lucky. Perhaps this is a stretch of admittance for some of us, myself included, but let's try it. Here we go. Plato's Atlantis account was an allegory. This stings, doesn't it? It is the age-old lesson that material possession and the urge for power leads a person into darkness and psychological despair, no matter how much he has accumulated. And then his neighbor is forced to act the same way for the sake of providing for himself and his family the essentials that the power-hungry first guy is taking up at such a rapid pace. And then his neighbor needs to keep up and acts a fool, all the while passing this unquenchable thirst onto their children, who, like the person in Plato's cave, will only come to know that way of behavior. Once this despair has spread its malignant tendrils to the rest of the community, being presented with a new and brighter way of living will frighten them so much that they shield their eyes to remain blind. Hey, it's all they know, the shadows on the wall. Once the shadow consumes this community, it is now contagious to society, a society that will do anything to keep themselves from drowning from thirst. This malignant destroyer of worlds might be considered a screaming Nexus, a living sentient being that pulls into its stomach everything it can to feed on the only thing it knows: suffering. So, to address the question put forth in our intro, is there such a thing as a cosmic horror that consumes societies that get too big? Yes, there absolutely is. And you experience its tendrils every day. And when somebody tells us that we are living in a cave of shadows and that there is a better way, well, what do? The Egyptian priest kings made it clear to Solon that the reason the post-flood natives don't remember the immortal wisdom of the past wasn't just because they were illiterate. Oral tradition has always been firmly installed to further pass the torch. They don't remember because they were too focused on surviving on scraping up scraps shed by those who live in so much fear that they take everything for themselves. Dogs chasing their own tails, chasing the one thing all animal-natured beings look for: closure. That closure will never come, and we will thirst for a proper and comforting ending forever. It's time to stop. Right now, in this moment, you have probably completely forgotten that we are still pretending to admit that Plato's account is an allegory. The uncomfortable feeling we just forced ourselves to experience dissolved once our eyes adjusted to the sunlight outside of that particular cave. That cave is the shadow that demands closure and answers instead of experiencing the search itself. The quest is not meant to be finished. It is meant to be passed on to the next generation. And when the torch enters their hands, the wisest thing we can tell them to do with it is clear. To put it simply, we should basically tell them that